Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about venture investing in the data and artificial intelligence sectors and what trends are driving those emerging sectors. To discuss that, I'm joined by someone who's right in the thick of the action. With me is Danel Dayan, principal at Battery Ventures. Danel, very good to have you with us today.
James, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Just to clarify, you are a venture investor, so startups come to you and they want to make their dreams come true. You may or may not choose to invest in them. You must get a lot of pitches. Is that an accurate description of your regular job?
Yeah, I mean, in its most simplistic form, yes. I like to think of it as building relationships with founders and entrepreneurs and companies. And if there's an opportunity to partner up with them through their journey, I think we're very fortunate to be part of that. But in most cases, 90% of the time, we're building relationships here.
Are you? And you're typically giving advice to those founders, I assume, as you go, or is it more like here's the support, do with it as you will?
No, I think advice is a big part of it. We think of sort of like the investment life cycle across, building the relationships, partnering with them, and then joining their boards and being part of that small group of people that they could find in for things that are very strategic to the business, as well as things that are very personal to the teams that are around the table.
Yep. All right, so I know you focus on early stage investments in the data and AI sector. Obviously, there's a lot going on there. You could probably take about 4 hours to answer this, but in a more or less nutshell, what trends do you see driving the markets as companies rush to adopt AI?
Yeah, happy to jump into it. So maybe just for a little bit of context, right? Battery Ventures itself is a stage agnostic venture growth fund. We've been around for 40 years. We've been investing in enterprise software and infrastructure through that period. That includes data, developer tools, machine learning, as well as security. And so, as we think about where we are in the cycle that touches data and AI, I think we're very early in the adoption of AI becoming mainstream, but we've been investing in this space from the very beginning. With the early data revolution, we were investors in Databricks, we were investors in Dataiku, and predicating that thesis was that data was going to be a big component of enterprises moving forward. And I think the way that we're seeing it today is data has manifested itself this year around generative AI. How do we take data that a lot of enterprises have been able to consume, store, analyze over the last 10 years, and actually start to expose that to their customers, to users, and then start to actually create new artifacts from it. And I think that's the shift in where we are relative to where we have been. But I think this is something that a lot of funds, ourselves included, have been investing over the period, essentially, building the foundation to be able to support these types of use cases. Now, that said, what I think is really interesting is the building blocks for what these like AI type applications ultimately look like are being built right now. And that means, everything from the database architecture to how things are cached, to ensuring how prompts and requests into models are going to be consistent, secure, governed. All of that is sort of like being laid right now in terms of the foundation for these AI type applications. And so, when you ask around what are some of the trends, I think the biggest one right now is what is truly the architectural decision that teams are making around adopting AI within their company. And we're excited about what are some of those foundational layers, whether that be vector databases, whether that be model monitoring solutions that are ultimately going to enable enterprises to get models into production, to get AI applications into production.
It's interesting you would talk about the data in particular, in that I think before the whole AI craze came on board with ChatGPT's debut last year, the big topic was data analytics, and it feels like we've kind of forgotten about data analytics, so it doesn't create that headline. And it's the irony of that artificial intelligence obviously goes nowhere without mass storehouse of data repositories. And obviously, as you say, there's really an infrastructure going on there. AI is not just a fairy dust, a pixie dust that we sprinkle on things. It needs a big, heavy infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. I think the last 10 years, of investing in data infrastructure was very much analytical driven. But again, like the thesis was very much around there was this exponential growth of data happening across users, across devices, across enterprises. And it was ultimately, how do we actually take these large sets of data and make them actionable for consumers? Historically, that was very much analytical driven. That was very much probabilistic driven, right? And these were just very sophisticated probabilistic models that spat out, certain distributions for what decisions should be. Where we're getting now, which I think is very interesting, is we're able to harness that data, expose it in a way that we historically haven't been able to do. And what I mean by that is, analytical use cases are very much internal facing. You're looking at BI dashboards for your finance team. You're looking at BI dashboards for your sales team. And as we layered on these transformer models, generative AI models, what that allows us to do is actually take that data and generate new pieces of content, new artifacts, whether that be voice, images, text, content, and those things can be consumed by external parties, whether that's customers, users, what have you. And so I think we're moving, and the way we sort of see it is we're transitioning from data being a very internal resource that is consumed internally to something that can now be exposed. And the types of applications that we're just starting to see are what's really interesting. And I think we're just scratching the surface on that.
I'm not sure I totally understand the idea of the data being exposed. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So essentially the way I sort of think about it is these models allow you to, take proprietary data of enterprises, of your company, and then generate, some artifact or derivative content from that, right? And historically, those would have to be done manually, but now the internal data, that's sort of the foundation for those models, right? That's the source of truth for that generated content. And I think so. It's sort of a much cleaner pipe from data to actual application in a way that I don't think we've seen in the past. What I mean by that is, the generated content is actually a derivative of the internal data that's now being consumed by someone else. And in most cases, the applications that we're seeing is that those are external facing. So take, for an example, Adobe, right? You're a customer of Adobe. You have 1,000 images that you're working with. Historically, you would need designers in order to create or generate new images, or you need photographers to actually upload those into your library, and then you can do some pre or post processing on that. Now you can actually rely on that corpus of data that you have, generate new pieces of content with that, and those can be added to your library that then get exposed to your customers in some way. So it's a more elegant way, I think, of building these types of applications that we haven't been able to see in the past.
Gotcha. Okay. So before we leave the foundational piece, I want to touch on the idea of large language models, which you've talked about models, but it seems like a lot of companies are grappling with that core idea that, do we need to build our own large language model? Can we, access one in exchange in a marketplace somewhere, or do we have enough? Or our competitors have a large language model. I mean, what is your sense of like the evolution of the large language model as a key piece in this whole picture?
Yeah. So one framework that we use to evaluate this is whether enterprises are going to require to bring data to the model or model to the data. Our view is that models are going to come closer to the data, meaning enterprises are actually going to start to consume more models themselves and build more models themselves. And I think we're seeing that with the explosion of all the open source models that have actually come over the last quarter or so. It's easier to ingest models, to build them within your own enterprise and guardrails and environment, and then use them for a specific use case that you actually need, versus pushing everything to a large context window model like OpenAI or Anthropic, for example. Now, I think the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. There will be use cases where it makes sense to actually use some of these, foundational models like an OpenAI, for example. And that could be something as simple as handling customer support or text generation for a specific use case that might not be necessarily ingesting proprietary data. But for things that are very specific to an enterprise, Gong, for example, in our portfolio, that uses machine learning and large language models to help generate feedback on sales calls. That's something that's core IP to them. And they've in-housed a lot of the expertise around that, including the model component piece. And so we think there's going to be sort of a variance and gradient for how adoption happens. But I have a view that models are coming to the data, and that means being able to build very specific models that that hit a specific use case. So I think we'll actually see a proliferation of models. There will obviously be the large language, the foundational ones that the OpenAIs and Anthropics have, and there'll be use cases for that. But I think it'll also be very easy to consume, models, within your own enterprise and on top of your own proprietary data.
Interesting. All right. Well, then the big question that I think many people are wondering is generative AI truly radically reshaping business as it appears to be, or is it in fact merely another forward moving technology? Is this just another, cell phone / internet introduction, or is this really reshaping everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think both can be true. And if you look at the history of application and infrastructure evolution, sometimes you need these types of applications to push technology forward and to push innovation at the infrastructure level forward. And I think that's what we're seeing today. Generative AI applications are stressing the existing infrastructure around CPU capacity, memory processing, in a way that we haven't seen over the last 10 years. And that's requiring us to rethink, what does the data structure look like? What are the chips that are required to support these types of applications? How do we increase the efficiency, the throughput, the ability to consume these levels of data within our enterprise in a way that we haven't been able to do before? And I think that's, pushing the hardware forward and, in a sense, pushing technology forward in many ways. So that's one sort of aspect that I think is very interesting that we're seeing with this, with the rise of generative AI applications. At the same time, like I said, it's the first time in 10 years that I think we're moving from analytical data workloads and applications to one that are more, generative in nature and external facing in nature. Right. And so that's also impacting, the application side of things, creating new applications that we're still just scratching the surface on. And so, in a long-winded way of saying that, I think both things are true. We're seeing a reshaping, a replatforming, a rebuilding of the infrastructure layer and the core technology layer to support these types of workloads. And at the same time, that's enabling new types of applications to be built in parallel.
Interesting. Okay, I see there's sort of a two sides to that answer. Interesting, and this may be slightly off topic, but let's see if we can go there. And that seems like that I'm surprised at the amount of fear that has bubbled up about artificial intelligence. Say before ChatGPT, there was a sense of the sunny optimism about it. It seems like the last several months there's a brooding sense like, this is going to ruin us somehow. I'm not sure that exactly impacts what you do as an investor, but do you have a personal take on that question?
Yeah, I think I think there's pros and cons to all sorts of these technologies. The reliance of generative AI as a medium for writing, for content creation, I think could have impact to society, whether that's on the educational level, on the critical thinking level, those sort of things. I haven't seen the applications move to that point where we have to be fully reliant on them, or we are fully reliant on them. I do think that place now where there's still a lot of human input that is required to actually have the desired output that I think all of us are typically looking for when doing sort of these use cases. So yeah, I think maybe there's a world where these models get as sophisticated as people believe that they will be. But I think part of what we're building now, and I think part of what we're seeing be built is, do we have the right guardrails in place so that we believe that the content that's being generated from these large language models are safe, are secure, are auditable, have the right sources associated with it. And I think people are building with that in mind, and I think that's a good place to be. The other aspect I'll say is when you think about where the adoption has come from very quickly, it's actually come from incumbents, those with a lot at stake at play, right? And so I think the way that they're building is a lot more thoughtful.
Such as, I'm sorry, when you were saying incumbents, who do you mean in this case?
The Microsofts of the world, the Googles, the Amazons, Adobes, they've been very quick at actually releasing generative AI type applications through their existing platform and through their distribution channels. Right. And it's interesting to see because one, I think that requires a level of robustness and sophistication and security that you typically wouldn't see if it started in a more grassroots effort, or it started only specifically, targeting startups or smaller companies that maybe didn't have the resources to think about those implications from day one. And I think the fact that we're seeing some of these larger companies adopt it, lean into it, means I think it will be built with more reliability in mind, more safety in mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well then certainly there are some winners and losers as this new technology gains ground. There always is. Who, in your view, gains and who loses ground as generative AI gains adoption?
Yeah, so I think touching on the last point, the observation of this cycle is just how fast some of these incumbents or larger companies have actually moved into the space. That being the Microsofts of the world, Adobe's, Notions, Figmas, for example. And I think that's a strong validation that these types of applications are real, that the demand for them is real, and the benefits, whether that be economically or from the types of productivity gains users can get are also real. And you rarely see that dynamic happen with new market cycles, but I think that is a strong signal of where the potential winners can be and where the potential value is going to accrue. I don't think that I think that the loss ratio of adopting AI is actually quite low. I think there's a lot of benefit. Said another way, right? I think if you introduce AI into your application, the actual floor of or loss potential, for example, is a lot lower than I think people perceive. Meaning, if the AI application produces a bad result on a chat, a user will just stop using the chat, right? And you can improve on that experience until you get it right. So I actually think the benefits of this are a lot higher and a lot more uncapped than I think people are actually realizing. Which is exciting to see that these big companies are able to move this quickly, and exciting to see how much excitement there is from the early stage ecosystem as well.
Okay. Well, let's look to the future. I think that is really the big question. The future of generative AI and data in the enterprise. I think one of the problems with forecasting is that there is a certain exponential nature with AI. It can learn, unlike other technologies, it can learn by itself. So it does create an element of unpredictability. Still, I'll ask you, what do you see in the future in terms of guiding your own investments?
Yeah, the big thing we're looking for is honestly enterprise adoption, and it's kind of interesting to say that after the conversation just we had, but the adoption of where we are today is still very much sort of development and test in the development and testing phase, and I think we're just scratching the surface on what are the requirements needed for enterprises, large enterprises, think the Gs of the world, Fox Telecoms, what have you, to actually introduce this type of technology and expose it as part of, their suite of offerings. And the things that we're looking for from an investment perspective is, are you actually able to enable enterprises to on-ramp more models into production, more AI applications into production in a meaningful way? And we're just still so very early in understanding the requirements around that. And so that's really what I'm looking for. I think the tip of the iceberg will be once enterprises really start to adopt this in a meaningful way. We see a little bit of that with our investment in Arise, which monitors models in production, and a big qualifier for them is how many models are you actually running, and does that sort of is there enough breadth there that you require a monitoring solution for that? And so we think that's going to be a leading indicator for how this category and space ultimately evolves.
Mm-hmm. We're not here for talking enterprises. One of the issues is that they know it's going to be expensive and they sort of have no choice. They need to invest in it. But it is expensive. It's not just like adding another Microsoft module to your cloud platform. You already have AWS. It's a significant amount of money. So they're wondering, we need to get on board. It's a lot of money. Is it going to pay itself back? Wouldn't ask you to answer that question today, but it seems like it is a question that the companies are thinking about these days.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I think we're seeing pricing today, right? It's an add-on to existing pricing structures, an ARPU, average revenue per user uplift, if you will. For example, Notion may charge $10 per user for their premium offering, and then charge $5 per user for their AI assistant. It's a 50% ARPU on top of their existing pricing model. So seeing some of that validation come through in terms of pricing and business models is an indication of the value that can be captured. Microsoft has obviously pioneered this as well by introducing some of the AI features through their Office 360 products. But that's sort of like one aspect to think about it. The other way I would think about it is the investment that's already been made across the data infrastructure and data ecosystem. So Databricks, for example, is really enabling companies to expose and operationalize machine learning and artificial intelligence in a meaningful way and in a production grade way. And I think a lot of the investment has already been made by companies and enterprises in building that foundation around Databricks and Snowflake and your cloud data warehouse. And now they're allowing you to add a catalog on top of that to manage your models, to manage the data assets that are going to be feeding into those models, manage the databases like a vector database that actually help retrieve specific information from your proprietary data through your model. So all of these, I think, investments have been actually made over the last couple of years. The question is actually, how much is it going to cost to operationalize all of this in a meaningful way? And I think that's what we're still getting to grips of. There is a component of training and inference, and I think that cost curve is coming down very quickly. And that comes back to my prior point of, we are rethinking what is the hardware, what is the compute infrastructure layer required to support these things. And I think it's just a matter of time before we get to a place where it will be fairly cost effective.
All right. Well, that is optimistic, to be sure. Managers will be glad to hear that. Danel, I think you said it. It's a lot of good stuff. I learned a ton. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, and please come back and talk with us again sometime.
Thanks, James. Good to be on.